Another significant debate at the École des Beaux-Arts during the 18th and 19th centuries was the polychrome debate, the debate around the extent to which color was used in ancient Greek architecture. In other words, was Greek architecture perfect, universal, and pure in its whiteness, in its transcendental quality of being both all color and no color at the same time? Or was color used sporadically in Greek architecture as a contextual marker, as a response to grounded site conditions such as light, heat, and culture? Now it should be noted that while Vitruvius himself wrote about the sporadic application of color to ancient architecture, the assumption until the end of the 18th century was that such applications were merely accents. The main parts of buildings were widely accepted as being white, a color that, while abstractly representing universality, is nonetheless a concrete essential property of stone and marble, both earthly and geological materials. But this debate was more than just a matter of to paint or not to paint. For an architectural culture conditioned to accept symmetry and proportion as ultimate expressions of perfection, the very possibility that color may have been used systematically in ancient architecture as a cultural and aesthetic device was a direct attack on canonical architectural theory. If architecture was pure white, it was a product of universal law and mathematical reason, an expression of what Claude Perrault called positive beauty. If architecture used color, then perhaps it was conditioned by its context, an arbitrary beauty, a product of its time and place. It was this tension between time and timelessness, place and placelessness, that launched one of the most intense theoretical debates in architectural history behind the walls of one of its most significant institutions. One of the biggest proponents of the superiority of architecture's whiteness was the 19th century German art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann. And Winckelmann defined the essence of beauty in both art and architecture, or perhaps better said, Greek sculpture and Greek architecture, as contour or form. Now the two terms are interesting because while they may sound synonymous, or while we may use them synonymously, they both imply slightly different things. When you think of a contour is always the outermost line of an object or a form. So by definition, a contour of something is the very line that separates its inside from its outside. So to say that the essence of beauty is in a contour, what Winckelmann is hinting at or implying is that that line that defines the autonomy of the object is the very locus of that object's beauty. In other words, the object is defined as beautiful in its very separation from the outside world. So it's an interesting thing to use the term contour. Now, when we think of a form, we think of an articulate object or an object that has, as part of its properties, a specific articulation or relationship between its parts and the whole. So, in any case, if the essence of beauty is either contour or form, or perhaps both contour and form, what it does is that it emphasizes the sort of mathematical, geometrical, autonomous qualities of those forms, but it also de-emphasizes any kind of material imperfection or anything that falls out of that realm of the perfect, articulate, closed form. He also argued in many of his writings that the degree of a marble's whiteness affected the beauty of sculpture, and by definition, the beauty of architecture. So, that material property of marble, while we may understand it to be grounded and earthly, for Winckelmann, reached perfection and an ultimate state of beauty depending on the degree of its actual whiteness. And perhaps most interestingly, for me at least, Winckelmann said that the color white was the color that best reflected light and thus best defined contour or outline. So, in an interesting twist, this color white, that color that is both all color and no color at the same time, the ultimate expression of universality, also happens to be the color that most intensely and most comprehensively interacts and reflects the particularities of place, in this case, light. And so the burning question was then, does architecture stand outside of time, universally applicable, dedicated to deities, based on eternal rules, or does it occupy the inside of place, culturally specific, used by humans, based on relative norms, etc.? What's more important here? That the Parthenon was based on proportions, or that the proportions themselves reveal a specifically Greek worldview? That the architecture looks down on the city, or that despite its elevated position, it blends almost seamlessly into the ground? That through the temple you can, quote, read a mathematical formula? Or that its very materiality, and perhaps its faded colors, help you feel the Mediterranean light? Such questions, of course, cut to the very core of what would become historic preservation, conservation, and restoration, which were essentially extensions of archaeology. Now you recall that neoclassicism is not a, quote, new classicism per se, but a kind of newly discovered, verified, and rationalized classicism. This in mind, one might ask, if the task of preservation is to protect history, which history does one foreground and protect? The timeless and universal one as part of a unified global history, or the situated and local one as part of a specific culture, the white one or the colored one? If the task of restoration is to reconstruct history, or historic artifacts, how much license does one have to interpret the past? And what does that say about the present, or about the motivations of the restorer? It was J.I. Hittorf, a student of Henri Lebroust, who we'll discuss in a moment, who in a paper arguing for architectural polychromy in antiquity, written in 1824 and submitted to the Institut de France, would grapple with these very questions. In 1830, he delivered another theoretical text on the topic, followed by an exhibition of colored graphic reconstructions of the Temple of Empedocles, eventually published in 1851. Now, what's remarkable about his work was not only his argument for and defense of architectural polychromy in antiquity as a purely archaeological exercise, but the fact that he was actively exploring how color could be used in contemporary architecture. Now, of course, all architecture is contemporary at the time of its conception. Perhaps the most interesting thing about his drawings, at least to me, is that they intertwine archaeology with a sort of counterfactual reconstruction of history. That is, the drawings, carefully measured, yet highly saturated like this temple, are both factual representations of antiquity, the architecture as it was, and desired projections of history, the architecture as it could have, or perhaps more politically motivated, should have been. In this sense, color was used subversively as a weapon against the universal classical canon. Again, the particularities of place and the desire for revolution, and I'll point out parenthetically here that this was consistent with the political climate of France during that time, destabilized received notions of classical antiquity. Architecture was both outside of time and inside of place. Little wonder, then, that Hittorf's work was seen by many in the ECOLE, both students and faculty alike, as sacrilegious, a gross and self-indulgent violation of timeless architectural principles. In many ways, the battle lines were drawn, and that old debate between the ancients and the moderns was reignited, not around questions of architectural proportions, but around the architectural surface. But it was his completion of the Church of St. Vincent de Paul in Paris in 1844 that exemplifies both his adaptation of polychromy to contemporary use and the power of the architectural drawing or painting to reveal, project, and distribute authorial intent, in itself a highly aesthetic and political act. This elevation shows Hittorf's modifications to the original design by the architect Jean-Baptiste Loupert, a highly saturated series of painted surfaces interacting with intense natural light, texture, and deep shadows, versus what was actually built, an almost white Greek temple front with a back wall made of exposed and otherwise natural stone masonry. It is important to see the politics at play here. On one hand, Hittorf projects a forceful and counterfactual completion of the original project. On the other hand, he builds, perhaps could only build, in a way consistent with the expectations of the day. And his ideas, of course, extended into the architectural interior. So here's a sort of projected vision of what the interior of this project would look like. So again, it perhaps wasn't built this way, but nonetheless we see the use of color here as a sort of counterfactual tool, right, to sort of project a vision of what this architecture could or should look like. Highly influenced by Hittorf's work was Henri Lebroust, who by the mid-19th century was already seen as a sort of radical, revolutionary, and heretic by both faculty and students at the ECOLE over his use of color in architecture. So, like Hittorf before him, he used color as a weapon against the laws of standard classical architecture, seeing buildings instead as regional responses to local building materials and to the effects of functional, historical, and cultural conditions. Now, a fun fact about Lebroust. At the ECOLE, he was seen as a sort of revolutionary leader for those growing anxious over the strict adherence to classical architecture. So those that wanted to critically and subversively protest against the architectural establishment, in other words, against the curriculum or against the faculty teaching the curriculum, they would mark their allegiance to Lebroust by poching their drawings in the color red instead of the customary and neutral black. Now, of course, red has a strong association with political revolution, especially in France in the 19th century. Interestingly, a drawing like this, a reconstruction of the ruins of Pompeii, might be confused in its use of color as being superficial, or as being more concerned with surface than function or use. Yet I'd argue that nothing could be further from the truth. If we accept Lebroust's position toward the relationship between color and context, again as expressions of and or reactions to local building material or the history and culture of place, etc., we might even detect the opposite. I mean, aren't these functional considerations after all? Doesn't replacing universal law with local custom seem more rational than a one-size-fits-all architectural system, despite the science and math behind number and proportion? I mean, it would seem here, in this sense, that external or aesthetic appearance relates directly to reason and function. And these are some more of his drawings. So again, the use of color, not only necessarily reconstructing architectural projects or scenes, but also studying architectural elements at more than one scale. And this would translate eventually to Lebroust's interest in structure. But we see a sort of recurring theme here, a recurring desire to look through the history of architecture and sort of project it otherwise through the use of color, and an exploration of this at multiple scales. His cenotaph for Le Perrot, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, of 1829. Again, another example of the sort of beautiful, washed, sort of colored drawing with the sort of soft textures, a contrast to the way that these kinds of buildings, monuments, cenotaphs, of course, being projects that are meant to memorialize, right, or sort of keep alive the memory of someone forever. These are usually depicted as being very austere, very plain. So think some of the drawings by Etienne Louis Boulet, right, sort of larger than life. The only sort of color that made its way, if you can even consider it color, was shadow, right, a sort of architecture that is so big that it escapes comprehension. This drawing by LeBrousse is in many ways the opposite of that, right? So it's soft, it's at a manageable scale, it introduces subtle tones of color that interact with shadow. So if a Boulet is meant to be sort of timeless, again, sublime, right, it escapes your ability to conceptualize what you're looking at. For LeBrousse, this cenotaph is meant to be ingrained in its time and in its place, in its culture. And similar drawings, of course, a tomb, so an architecture that is again related to death and memory, but not expressed as a sort of one-size-fits-all monumental white or stoned architecture, but as something that is rich and saturated in color. So the universality of memory and infinity meets the ground, if as it were, right? The sort of cultural condition on the ground. Interestingly about LeBrousse, aside from his use of color, was his exploration of structure, particularly the use of iron in buildings. And the Bibliothèque in Sainte-Geneviève in Paris, built in 1851, one of Lebrousse's most beautiful projects. And the use of iron, of course, gives the interior, not only does it allow for these long spans, and again, I'll remind you of Boulet, the library that he drew, or the idea that the revolutionary architects of a century or two before could have only imagined things but couldn't build them. Here, the use of iron allows Lebrousse to make these large spaces, right? So these sort of wide span spaces. So it's a really interesting interior, quite beautiful. It sort of feels light and airy, and at the same time, you can tell by the side walls that there's a sort of heaviness to it, so that if you were to look at this building from the outside, it would feel very heavy, but from the inside, there's a sort of infinite, open, airy, lightweight sort of space. And this is, of course, due to iron. Iron is going to come up more and more now as we move towards discussions of modernization and the Industrial Revolution, and the sort of changes in technology and material production. And this is what the outside looks. So again, a complete contrast between interior and exterior. And it is, in fact, as I've mentioned before, I'll sort of put my biases out on the table. It's one of my favorite aspects of this project. The fact that there is some relationship between inside and outside, but one doesn't necessarily correlate directly to the other. In other words, the relationship is thick and opaque, not thin and transparent. It would be modernism that would seek a thin and transparent relationship between inside and outside. But for Lebrousse, for the Bibliothèque in Sainte-Geneviève, it was a thickened relationship. And yet, there are some registrations, right? You can tell when you look at the interior that it is contained by a particular exterior. But the correlation is not necessarily one-to-one. And the drawings of what the library would have looked like. Because, of course, the built product is very close to the actual drawing. It's actually quite beautiful lead drawing of this project. But one of the things you start to notice is a change of attitude towards the plan. Now, if you compare this plan to some of the other ones we've seen in this course, think about some of the previous lectures, particularly the one on early neoclassicism, where we saw various basilicas. You notice that the plan begins to feel perhaps a bit less plastic, and one of its characteristics is that it's perfectly symmetrical. And this is the sort of typical Beaux-Arts plan, right? A typical Beaux-Arts plan is going to have two main elements. It's going to have axiality, right? It's going to have a long axial condition that regulates the way spaces sort of relate to each other, and it's going to have symmetry, right? So axiality and symmetry. And these qualities become, for Beaux-Arts practitioners or faculty and students, the main elements of architectural composition. So, much like we saw in Durand, we begin to see a stronger emphasis on the plan, but to the point that the elevation almost doesn't matter. Actually, elevation is probably not the right term, as I've discussed before, yet. We're still dealing with facades. But the emphasis becomes so heavily on the plan that the facade itself takes on a secondary kind of importance. And this would, of course, enable a certain eclecticism. Again, if the work of the architect is about articulating the plan, and the facade is really, the facade belongs to the realm of, let's say, the client or the city or the context or what have you, the facade can almost be anything, right? And if the facade can be anything or a mixture of anything, what you get is eventually eclecticism. And some more drawings of the bibliothèque, this time in color. And so, if anything, this demonstrates Lebras' ability to really produce a beautiful, rich architectural drawing. And what I love about this one is that all of this talk about color and detail and shadow all kind of come together, right? The architectural drawing, in other words, is no longer, and this was what Durand was doing, the architectural drawing, contrary to Durand, actually has meaning. It has spatial meaning. It puts you into a space, and therefore it relates to the architectural intent of that space. Whereas, of course, for Durand, the architectural drawing was simply an instrument, as we've discussed. And similar drawings, again, the ability to study very particular qualities of the architecture or very specific details, right? To the point that the structure is sort of foregrounded by being drawn darker, and everything else is sort of washed or almost transparent, although not literally transparent, but sort of rendered in a more transparent way. And we even begin to see the hint or the implication that the detailed drawing can be overlaid with a diagrammatic drawing, right? And this is really interesting, especially in 1851, a sort of hybrid drawing. And we see that they become more and more hybrid, right? So again, it captures constructional qualities, spatial qualities, it captures the physics of structural forces. On the bottom left of the sheet, you have a structural diagram. On the top right, you have a corner detail. And so you begin to see the sort of layered, rich drawings of this project. Another library that he designed, built in 1868, was the National Library of France. And here, the structure becomes even more refined, more emphasized. And look how thin those columns are. It's an architecture that really challenges, to an extreme degree, the column itself as a carrier of cosmological, mathematical, proportional meaning. Here, the column is only as thin as it needs to be, right? And so the contrast between that these thin iron columns and the heavier domes that it supports is a beautiful, gives off a sort of beautiful spatial effect, right? This becomes less about the heaviness of the material and more perhaps in tune with the Gothic, about the lightness of iron and steel and the airiness of color and light. And again, drawings of what that would look like. There's an amazing ability actually to capture, and again I referenced the revolutionary architects and this idea of the sublime and the notion of architecture as being a smaller part of a larger environment. There's a remarkable ability for these drawings to capture environmental qualities, right? To the point that they're perhaps even exaggerated. So this drawing feels very warm, perhaps exaggeratingly warm. Other drawings might feel exaggeratingly cold, right? So this is not just the capturing of an environment, but it's the rendering of the environment as a sort of ingrained an intrinsic part of the architectural idea. Architecture here, in other words, doesn't just sit in an environment, but it becomes part of an environment, and it even transforms the environment even as it becomes influenced by that environment. And of course, models. Pretty similar to the ones that you guys should be making. Hint. And we do have a laser cutter, so it's probably easier than it seems, although it's a bit overwhelming. But still, models as a way to sort of study these conditions and as a form of representation. So I just put this in there because it really just is an exquisite model. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about today is the role of composition, and this is particularly in the late period of the École des Beaux-Arts and extends into actually the 20th century. And the lens through which we'll discuss this is through one Julien Guadet. And Guadet was essentially the last standing of the École des Beaux-Arts faculty. And his ideas were actually pretty profound, again, for the evolution of modernism, right? Both for being those ideas that the modernists love to hate, yet at the same time, ideas that were also highly influential. And in 1902, he wrote his own treatise, which is essentially a series of lectures and surveys of buildings, and building types and building elements. He called it Elements of a Theory of Architecture. Interestingly, there is no comprehensive theory to his treatise. It is essentially a handbook on architectural composition. And this is what Guadet's legacy really consists of. He argued not for a theory of architecture, but essentially, much like others before him, reduced architecture to a particular thing, in this case, composition. Not in the way that Durand did, right? Durand had a different set of ideas. For Durand, it was the disposition of the plan, etc. But for Guadet, architecture was essentially nothing other than composition. This is an example of the kind of architecture included in his treatise. It's also an example of the kind of architecture he would teach his students to produce. Typical Beaux-Arts facade, axial plan, symmetrical elevation, a sort of proper use of architectural elements, and a proper disposition of architectural elements based on very simple, straightforward compositional qualities. So symmetry, for example, balance, repetition. So for Guadet, this is sort of an interesting thing to think about. There was no theory of architecture outside of the way that one produced architecture itself. In other words, you can either look for architectural content and then transpose or infuse that architectural content into a way of making architecture, or if you were like Guadet, you would say, well, there is no architectural content. The act of making and composing architecture is itself architectural content. Therefore, there's no need to look outside of composition for architectural content. Right? The theory of architecture, in this sense, is either non-existent or takes on a completely different shade of meaning and has a completely different use. But to sum up with his ideas, and I want you to keep these in mind because this will come up as, again, we begin to discuss 20th century architecture or modernism. The key ideas that Julien Guadet puts out through his treatise is that, one, he insists on the importance of composition in architecture, as we've discussed. But more than that, he considers composition to be a science. So composition itself is a science. Not proportion, not numbers, not cosmological relationships, not the orders. Composition itself. And what I guess we could say is typically French, he would argue that the more symmetries a building had, the better. Under his direction, the École des Beaux-Arts focused almost exclusively on axial planning. So, one of the things you'd have to demonstrate as a student before you graduated was not, as you are perhaps accustomed to, critical thinking, conceptual thinking, professional practice, the ability to apply the technology of the day, digital media. You can think of all the other things that you have to demonstrate. For the École des Beaux-Arts, you didn't have to demonstrate all of those things, but rather you had to demonstrate that you can properly put together an architectural plan, that you can properly understand the role of symmetry and axiality in planning, and a good thesis project would be a thesis project that would not look the best per se, but would be considered the best project because it had more symmetry. So it was a sort of skill to be able to do this. And under Guadet, more forcefully, the elevation became secondary. And I've mentioned this in the past, but I'll reiterate it because it's an important idea. When the emphasis is placed on the plan, when all you're focusing on is finding symmetries and axialities in plan, the elevation becomes essentially an extension of that in one sense. And in another sense, stylistically, is sort of seen as external to that process. In other words, it becomes outside of the realm of architectural composition. In other words, you can stitch a facade based on a number of different influences in architectural styles. You have a sort of eclectic facade. It's both Greek and Gothic and Renaissance. It could be quite elegant, or it could be a lump of stuff just sort of put together. And as long as all this is sort of regulated by the plan, maybe, just maybe, it's okay. Maybe, just maybe, it could be considered architecture. But I want to point out that there's an interesting correlation to this idea of eclecticism and functionalism. And I want to point this out because usually these ideas are seen as opposed. If you were a functionalist, one of the things that you were absolutely opposed to was being an eclecticist or an eclectic architect because you weren't concerned with style. You were simply concerned with function. But doesn't both the overemphasis on the plan and the idea that the form can only follow function both serve to equally eliminate the elevation from the equation? I mean, if in a Beaux-Arts model, your emphasis was on the plan and you can stitch together a facade made out of elements, of whatever elements you wanted, and in a modernist model, you didn't have to worry about facades at all because it would just be a direct extension of function, and this could be 2 or 3 dimensions. Doesn't that amount to essentially the same thing? That it's really function at the end that is important? So paradoxically, the very thing that hardcore functionalists love to hate, eclecticism, axial planning, symmetry, is also the very thing that became foundational to their development of a functionalist position. So keep that in mind. It's a very important idea. Things aren't always what they seem. And a couple of quotes, just to sort of leave this off and sort of frame the next lecture. Right? He wrote that to compose is to make use of what is known. Composition has materials just as construction has, and these materials are precisely the elements of architecture. So, a really interesting statement, right? That the material of architecture are the compositional, or the elements that are composed, right? And these are just as material as brick and stone and concrete and iron. So this was no doubt an attempt to turn composition, which could easily be linked to an abstract idea of proportions, into something scientific, empirical, material, something consistent with the age of the Enlightenment, something consistent with modern. And finally he asks, what is it to compose? He answers, it is to put together, weld, unite the parts of a whole. These parts, in their turn, are the elements of composition. And just as you will realize your conceptions with walls, openings, vaults, roofs, all elements of architecture, you will establish your compositions with rooms, vestibules, exits, and staircases. These are the elements of architecture. So again, it's an important idea to leave this off with, right? The idea that an architectural element is not limited to necessarily a material element, but an element can be a spatial element, and it can operate at different scales. An entire room can be an element. And of course, we saw this with Duron, but the attitude coming from Guadet is slightly different from that. Thank you.